There's nothing quite like a brand new roller coaster to create some excitement and boost attendance at a park. Some parks seem to get new attractions on a fairly regular basis, but others get neglected and go many long dark years without even the hint of getting a new coaster. Worse still, some parks have had rides removed and had nothing put in to replace them, and some parks are just lacking in attractions in general and just desperately need more things to do to make a visit worthwhile. In this video, I'll go through 7 of these parks and explore why they so desperately need a new coaster, and what that coaster should be. I'll try to keep things realistic and choose a ride that would complement the park's lineup, suit the typical targeted demographic, physically fit in the space the park has, and at least somewhat be feasible for the sort of budget I think they could afford. Whilst I'd love it if every park in the world could get their own dueling Intamin and RMC gigacoasters, I know that sadly isn't very realistic, but after a lot of thought, I've come up with some legitimate options that could feasibly be added to significantly improve the park experience in these places. I'm Rollercoaster David, and these are 7 parks that desperately need a new roller coaster, and what that coaster should be. First up, we have Dorney Park. Dorney Park already has a good selection of coasters, but with Hershey Park, Six Flags Great Adventure and Knoebels all within easy driving distance of it, it faces some really stiff competition. It's therefore quite surprising that they've now haven't added a brand new coaster in over 15 years. It did get a second-hand impulse coaster from Geauga Lake in 2008, but the last brand new roller coaster to be built specifically for the park was Hydra the Revenge, which opened way back in 2005. To make matters worse, in 2017 the park removed one of its adult coasters called Stinger, and it still hasn't been replaced with a new ride. There may be some hope for the park, however, as rumours have circulated following the release of some planning permission documents that the park is in line for a new coaster soon, but what's been proposed is rather unusual. The plans would use the space left over from Stinger, plus a bit of extra land, to build a small wooden shuttle coaster, similar to Switchback at ZDT's amusement park in Texas. To me, this seems like a really weird choice for the park, as they already have a decent wooden coaster, and it's unlikely that this small new coaster could compete with the other fantastic wooden rides in the region, such as Phoenix, El Toro and Lightning Racers. Also, it's been such a long time since the park received a new coaster, I think it deserves something a bit more substantial than what was being proposed. The wooden shuttle coaster plans only use a relatively small amount of space, which I've highlighted here in blue, but there seems to be several other areas that a new ride could be expanded into to make something much larger. So what should the park get instead? It already has a good variety of rides, including a large hypercoaster, a B&M invert, a floorless coaster, a wooden coaster and an impulse coaster, but I think there's an obvious choice, and for inspiration we only have to look to another park in the Cedar Fair chain and the most recent coaster built at Carowinds, Copperhead Strike. Copperhead Strike was a really fun addition to Carowinds, and I genuinely think a similar ride would be a fantastic fit for Dorney Park. A custom but similar layout with 2 launches, some nice twists and pops of airtime, and a couple of inversions would provide an experience that's very different to anything else already at the park, and in addition, there aren't really any similar coasters at nearby competing parks, so it can be marketed to bring in customers from those other parks and to appeal to people that haven't visited the park in several years. It could start by using the long straight section of land here by the road for a launch track, and after that the ride could cross over the road and continue into all these different areas. I had a quick go at designing something in Planet Coaster to see what sort of ride could fit in the space, and whilst I may have made things slightly unrealistic, there definitely seems to be enough space to build something quite impressive. An alternative to Copperhead Strike style coaster could be a multi-launched Intamin coaster similar to Maverick at Cedar Point, which of course I'd love for the park, but as it's been several years since Cedar Fair worked with Intamin, and given how reliable and successful Copperhead Strike has been, I think they'd be more inclined to work with Mack again instead. The next park we have that's crying out for a new coaster is Ferrari Land in Spain. This park needs a new coaster for very different reasons to Dorney Park. It was built right next to the well-established Portaventura Park as a separate gate and ticket, but in its present state, I don't think it's got enough attractions to justify this, and you quickly run out of things to do when you visit. There's only really one ride that makes the park worthwhile, and to be fair, it is the tallest and fastest coaster in Europe, the 367-foot tall, 112-mile-per-hour Red Force. Like similarly designed coasters, however, the whole ride is over in a matter of seconds, and when you've ridden it a few times, you kinda want to experience something else. Whenever I've been to the park, it's been very quiet, so getting multiple rides on Red Force can be done easily within half an hour or so, and after that you're left with a couple of decent shot towers, some barely worthwhile flat rides, and the 2 indoor attractions, a flying theatre and a motion simulator theatre. Those 2 are only really worthwhile experiencing once though, as you have to sit through the same pre-show for both of them, so they end up feeling more like an extended Ferrari advert than a fun ride. This means that as an adult, the only thing worth re-riding is Red Force, and whilst this huge coaster is certainly impressive and a breathtaking ride, it's not enough to sustain the park alone. The park really needs another big attraction or 2 that people will want to re-ride, and there's an obvious place to look for inspiration for this: the original Ferrari World Park in Abu Dhabi. When Ferrari World Abu Dhabi opened, it only had 2 roller coasters, but one of those was a dueling racing coaster which had 2 different sides to ride, and the other was Formula Rossa, the world's fastest coaster with a significantly longer ride time and layout than Red Force. Whilst a dueling racing coaster would be a good addition to the Spanish park, I think what would make more sense is to look at the first coaster Ferrari World built after it had opened, Flying Aces. This is an Intamin Hyper Wing coaster, similar to Skyrush at Hershey Park, but significantly longer, and with restraints that don't crush your thighs nearly as much. It was inspired by Enzo Ferrari's interest in aviation and the Italian pilot who designed Ferrari's logo, so the theming could fit in perfectly to the Spanish park. I'd be pretty happy with a 1-to-1 clone of Flying Aces, to be honest, as it's a great fun ride with plenty of strong airtime and twists, but a custom layout with a couple of extra inversions would be my top choice for the park. Portaventura does already have an amazing hypercoaster in the form of Shambhala, but an Intamin Hyper like Flying Aces would provide a very different experience with ejector airtime instead of sustained floater airtime and a much more aggressive layout. With regards to where to place the ride, there seems to be plenty of space for Ferrari Land to expand into the car park behind Red Force, and several large coasters could easily be built in this area. Sadly, however, it may be some time before Ferrari Land sees any new attractions, as the Portaventura company is instead planning on building another separate park, based on the La Liga Spanish Football League, rather than giving Ferrari Land the expansion it desperately needs. Hopefully the park will eventually get the investment it requires, and a Flying Aces style coaster would be the perfect start to this. Next up, we have the park that actually inspired this video, Valleyfair in Minnesota. Valleyfair is sadly one of the more neglected Cedar Fair parks, as it's now been over 13 years since it got a new coaster. Whereas Cedar Point and Kings Island seem to get a new significant ride every couple of years, Valleyfair has been left without, to the point where their own social media team even took the piss out of themselves on their Twitter feed, using the hashtag Valleyfairingit for going without a new coaster for 13 years. Valleyfair isn't a bad park either, and I enjoyed my visit there in 2017, but it definitely feels overdue for some sort of expansion. 2011 was the last time the park got a new coaster, but it was a second-hand family coaster, so it isn't really worth mentioning. Instead, we have to go back to 2007 when the park added something new, with a GCI wooden coaster called Renegade. What's worse is that one of their most unique coasters, Excalibur, has seemingly been living on borrowed time, as the park submitted plans to remove it and drain the area around it to build an access road in 2015. Thankfully, the ride still survives to this day, but for how much longer is unknown, which is a real shame as this Arrow hybrid coaster is quite different to any other ride I've been on, and it was actually one of my favourite rides at the park. So what new coaster should Valleyfair get so they can finally stop Valleyfairing it? Whilst a Copperhead Strike style coaster, like I suggested for Dorney Park, could also be a good fit here, I think the best option would actually be for a large B&M inverted coaster, or perhaps even one of the new generation Vekoma inverted coasters like Halzuberkoff at Tripsdrill. Whilst the park does have an impulse coaster, a more traditional inverted coaster is something that it's missing, and it would complement the park's lineup really nicely. There seems to be plenty of space for a ride like this as well, as regardless of whether Excalibur is removed and the area around it drained, some space at the front of the park recently became available. Last year the park closed its Dinosaurs Alive exhibit, and that frees up a good bit of space, with the option to expand into the car park if they need more. I'm not sure what sort of budget Valleyfair could afford to put into a new coaster like this, but I don't think it's inconceivable for them to try and break some world records if they did, and maybe they could even build the world's first inverted hypercoaster. The most recent B&M invert built at a Cedar Fair park was Banshee at Kings Island, and something similar could be a good fit for Valleyfair, although having ridden the new generation of Vekoma suspended thrill coasters, I'd love to see what that manufacturer could do with a layout of a similar size or even bigger. Perhaps it's a bit of a stretch, but if Valleyfair built a 220-foot tall suspended thrill coaster, it would be the tallest and fastest ride at the park, as well as the tallest and fastest inverted coaster in the world, something that would definitely put the park back on the map and rejuvenate interest in it, potentially drawing visitors in from a much larger area. A smaller, cheaper inverted coaster is probably a more realistic prospect, however, but even something similar to one of the Batman clones would be a very worthwhile addition to the park, and I'm sure locals would be happy with just about anything new being added. Next, we head to the UK and to Thorpe Park. The last new coaster Thorpe Park built was the Swarm back in 2012, and whilst the park have dabbled with the retheming of old coasters and experimented with the VR attraction, I think it's high time the park got a brand new coaster. Whilst I think every enthusiast in the UK would love for the park to get an RMC Hybrid or Raptor, or even a B&M hypercoaster, I think what would make the most sense for the park to build is an S&S 4D free spin coaster, like one of the Joker clones at Six Flags parks. When this coaster debuted as Batman the Ride at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, it took social media by storm, and even non-enthusiast friends of mine were sharing it with me, asking if I'd seen it. I think Thorpe Park would love that sort of attention and hype, and it could bring them a load of new visitors and ticket sales. It would be quite easy to market it as Europe's first coaster of that style, and it seems like a perfect fit for the park's target thrill-seeking demographic. Knowing Merlin and Thorpe Park, they would probably tie the theming to some flavour of the week IP, and maybe go with some dubious world first too. I can quite easily imagine it becoming the world's first coaster to be themed around a reality TV show, perhaps even naming it the Love Island coaster, Head Over Heels in Love. My cynicism aside, I do think that a free spin coaster would be a really good investment and would be completely unlike anything else at the park or anything nearby. Personally, this is far from being my favourite kind of coaster, but I know that it does have its fans, and whilst a copy of Arashi, the Japanese version of this ride, would probably be a bit too insane for the park, the more typical American free spins that only flip you a couple of times would work really well here. The compact layout of the ride doesn't take up much space either, and there's several options for where it could be built, perhaps even utilising the space of the former Slammer Flat ride, or being built inside the layout of Stealth. The closure of the Loggers Leap log flume also leaves a large space for a coaster, but I think it would be better suited to something else after a free spin was constructed. The next park that desperately needs a new coaster is Michigan's Adventure. Michigan's Adventure hasn't had a new coaster in 12 years, and sadly the most recent addition was a second-hand SLC. The last time the park got a brand new roller coaster is now over 20 years ago, so it's high time the park got something good and something new. There certainly seems to be a lot of space available for the park to expand into, and before Cedar Fair took over its management, it had actually been planning to build a 210-foot tall coaster, but sadly this never saw the light of day, although I think it's a good idea to revisit. A B&M hypercoaster of this size would be a great addition to the park, but after researching it a bit further, this doesn't seem to be what Cedar Fair have in mind for it. The nearest competition to Michigan's Adventure that has big roller coasters is Cedar Point, the top-tier park in the company's chain, and realistically, the park can't hope to compete with the coaster lineup it already has. I think the park could quite easily afford a large thrill ride, but that wouldn't make much sense as the park is now shifting more towards targeting families with younger children. So what could the park add that would be a good ride but also appeal to this family group? I've come up with two distinct options, the first of which is a Megalite style coaster like Alpina Blitz at Nigloland. It's a great fun airtime filled ride but isn't too tall to be overly intimidating, and it isn't super aggressive either, so it can be enjoyed by many different kinds of people. Personally, I think Alpina Blitz is a seriously underrated coaster, and it's quite surprising that more parks haven't built something similar. Another coaster that would be an option is an Intamin launched family coaster like Juvelin at Jers Summerland or one of their jet ski coasters. I think this would be a great fit for the park, and like Alpina Blitz, these kind of coasters aren't overly intimidating and they're simply great fun. It would also offer something unique to the park, as it would be the first launch coaster that it had, and if they invest enough into making it a good ride, it could even bring back fans that haven't visited the park in years, or entice back visitors who've only ever visited to ride Shivering Timbers. It would also be a pretty unique to the region, as the closest comparable coaster is probably Wavebreaker at SeaWorld San Antonio, which is well over 1,000 miles away. If they choose a similar jet ski theme to that as well, they could also make a fantastic looking coaster, as it could be built out over the lake in the centre of the park. The next park we're going to discuss is Six Flags America near Washington DC. Now, the last time this park got a brand new roller coaster was a whopping 19 years ago, and that ride was the rather awful Batwing, an old-style Vekoma Flying Dutchman coaster. The park has received a few second-hand coasters since then, including a notoriously rough B&M stand-up coaster, which was later converted into a floorless one, and a rather lackluster Revichon spinning mouse coaster, so I think the park really needs to get something new and something good. Whilst the most pressing thing I think the park should do is probably some maintenance on the Superman hypercoaster, which was shockingly rough the last time I rode it, there really is an obvious solution as to what the park should build next. The wooden coaster Roar has great potential to become a new RMC hybrid coaster. Interestingly, it actually has a twin coaster by the same name that was located at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom in California, but this actually received the RMC treatment in 2016, so it's certainly possible that you could make a good ride out of this wooden coaster. I even remember the last time I rode it thinking how the layout could make a really good RMC, and surely it's only a matter of time until this happens. I wouldn't want the layout to be exactly the same as Discovery Kingdom's ride, but RMC are creative enough that it could make something quite different despite the similar layouts. The final coaster on this list that desperately needs a new coaster is M&D's, Scotland's theme park in Motherwell. Now, I'm a proud Scottish roller coaster enthusiast, but even I've never actually been to this park, as I've never heard anything good about it. The lineup looks pretty abysmal, and last time I even considered going, the highlights, if you could call them that, were some rather awful looking Pinfari coasters, and even these have now been removed, leaving the park seriously lacking in the thrills department. The only coasters left are now a couple of kiddie creds and a tiny spinning wild mouse. So what should it add? It's obvious really. The park needs either a Giga Coaster, a Strata Coaster, or a record-breaking custom RMC T-Rex. Okay, so that would never happen, but realistically, if the park wants to survive, it needs something good and something new, but also something cheap. Brand new rides are probably out of the question then, but a decent second-hand ride could be a distinct possibility, and there's a couple of good choices out there. Looking at what's for sale on one of the industry websites, there's currently a double-looping Schwarzkopf coaster that would be a great start to rejuvenating this park. The photos appear to be of Laser at Dorney Park, which has travelled the world a bit since those photos, and is most recently known as Testtrekker, and it's been on the German funfair circuit quite a lot. I've ridden it a couple of times, and it's really rather good. It may be old, but it's a really solid ride, and it's got updated trains which make it all the better. Also on this site, there's a Schwarzkopf CityJet, another coaster style that I've ridden that's really good fun, and similarly, there's a shuttle loop that was at La Feria in Mexico City, which may also be up for grabs. Okay, so maybe I'd just like the park to become a Schwarzkopf museum with all their classic rides that are looking for a new home, but the more I think about it, the better that sounds, and maybe one day even Olympia Looping could make a visit there. These travelling coasters would also seem to be a perfect fit for the park's general lack of theming, and the temporary looking attractions that it's got. I know it's unlikely to happen, but I do hope that one day Scotland gets a decent coaster or two that it can be proud of. So there we have it, ideas for 7 parks that desperately need a new coaster. What do you think of these ideas, and what other parks are there out there that really need something new? Let me know in the comments and stay tuned for more videos from me in the near future. I've been Rollercoaster David, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video very soon.